A fat woman? Seriously, was that why you guys drew the police's attention? It was with that phrase that the mob boss looked at her, as if she was worth nothing. Sarah ignored her entire life, was about to die until she made a desperate decision. She lied. She said she loved him. Yes, to survive, she confessed love to the most dangerous man in the city. But what was supposed to be just a lie became the beginning of an absurd twist. The monster who was supposed to kill her ended up falling in love. And what you're about to hear now is one of those emotional stories that seem like a lie, but are too real to ignore. There are people who, when they enter a place, seem to carry a spotlight. Everyone notices. A perfume, a striking smile, a look that screams presence. But Sarah was the complete opposite of that. She didn't go unnoticed because she wanted to. She went unnoticed because life taught her that the silence of the corner of the room was safer than the pain of center stage. She was an obese woman, soft-spoken with tired eyes, who worked cleaning tables at a busy restaurant in downtown. She had the gift of disappearing even in broad daylight. The uniform, always a little tight, was another cruel reminder of the crooked looks she received daily. Each tray collected came with a disguised joke or a judgmental look, and she endured it. She endured it because she had understood, since very early on, that the world doesn't always offer space for those who don't follow the standard. She smiled, not because she was happy, but because it was easier to smile than explain the sadness. And while many were distracted among expensive dishes and conversations about promising careers, Sarah collected crumbs, not just of food, but of humanity. Those who look from the outside might even think, oh, she's just some employee. But those who lived it firsthand know. They know what it's like to wake up every day and prepare to be ignored. They know what it's like to be surrounded by people and still feel invisible. And that's where life shows its ironic side. It was precisely because she was invisible that she saw what she shouldn't have. That night, the restaurant was already closing when she heard a sharp noise in the back, something like a dull thud, out of place. Curious, she approached the pantry window and saw a man on the ground, bleeding, and right behind him, the cold face of whoever pulled the trigger. The killer saw her too. A brief second of eye contact that would seal her fate. It was a symbol on the ring that gave everything away. Moretti, this wasn't a common robbery. It was the mob in action. And she, the woman the world ignored, had witnessed something that no one should ever have seen. And it's curious how, sometimes, emotional stories are born from pain, right? The real stories that Marcus aren't made only of happy endings, but of unexpected twists. And there, with trembling hands and her heart trying to escape from her chest, Sarah understood that her life had just changed. What she had no idea about was that what would come next would involve not only fear and escape, but also something even more unlikely, a love forged between danger and lies. And that was just the beginning. There are things we only believe because we live them. And that early morning, when the whole world was sleeping, Sarah was waking up to the worst of nightmares. Hours after witnessing the crime, she was ripped from her home as if she were nothing. 3 masked men, armed, entered without saying a word. They covered her mouth, covered her head with a rough cloth, and threw her inside a moving car. Her heart felt like a war drum inside her chest. The smell of gasoline, the tense silence, the cold coming from the half-open window. Everything screamed danger. Until then, Sarah had spent her entire life hiding. And now she was the center of a story that no one would want to star in. There was no police. There was no justice. It was her, alone, in the hands of an organization that resolved things very differently from the civilized world. When the hood was finally removed, her eyes needed a few seconds to adjust to the light. She was in a dark warehouse, the floor covered in dirt, and in front of her Vincent Moretti, tall, imposing, with the look of someone who has seen more blood than love in life. Instead of anger, he carried contempt. He observed Sarah from top to bottom, as if he were analyzing an insect. The expression on his face left no doubt. She wasn't worth the effort of being there. And then he let out, coldly, "A fat woman? Seriously, was that why you guys drew the police's attention?" The environment froze. That wasn't just an insult. It was a sentence. And in that instant, between fear and humiliation, Something awakened inside her, a spark of survival. Perhaps a primitive instinct that screams when death is closer than hope. She understood, as few people would understand. If she wanted to get out of there alive, begging wasn't enough. She would have to play, enter his game, become a piece on a board where she barely knew the rules. Fear could be her greatest enemy, but it could also be her best motivation. And the truth is that there, facing the monster, she saw a chance. A tiny chance, but real, because sometimes when the enemy underestimates you, you gain time. And it's precisely in that time that the most unbelievable real stories are created. Sarah had already been ignored for a lifetime. Now, she would be noticed, even if it was for the most absurd lie she ever thought of telling. A lie that, without her knowing, was about to rewrite everything. There's no manual for surviving when you're face to face with death. Instinct takes the wheel, and the mind does what it can to not collapse. Sarah was there, sitting on a hard chair, surrounded by armed men who seemed made of stone. And in front of her, Vincent. The interrogation lasted hours, but it felt like days. He repeated the same question, as if he wanted to force the truth out. "Did you tell anyone?" She denied, cried, shook her head. Her voice came out trembling, between sobs and pleas. The fear had already passed a limit. Now it was pure panic. And it was when he approached slowly, pulled out the gun and pressed the cold barrel against her forehead, that everything changed. That metallic touch, cruel and impersonal, was the push that was missing. Something inside her screamed, "Say anything, now." And that's what she did. Without thinking, without planning. Her mouth spoke before reason understood. I just wanted to see you up close, because I admire you. I love you." Done. It was said. The words came out crooked, as if they didn't belong to that mouth. The lie was so absurd that the silence that came after almost hurt. Vincent stood still, static, confused, as if his mind was trying to process all of that. What was supposed to be an end, a last breath before the shot, became a pause. And in that pause, Sarah felt something she didn't expect. He hesitated. It was little, but it was all she needed. Time once again became her ally. And for the first time since she was kidnapped, she didn't feel like a target. She felt like a mysterious piece in a game that the monster himself still didn't understand how to play. And the most curious thing? It was precisely that lie that started the most unlikely turn in the story. Because Vincent, even though hardened by a lifetime of blood and betrayal, was intrigued. Who, in their right mind, would say something like that facing death? Who would look at him, the man who kills without blinking, and fake love? Something there awakened the mobster's curiosity. And if there's one thing the powerful can't stand, it's not understanding something. Sarah, with her fragile voice and constantly underestimated appearance, had created a puzzle. And at that moment, without realizing it, she stopped being just an inconvenient witness. She became the key to a story that no one saw coming. One of those emotional stories that are born where least expected, and that, even with a tragic beginning, promise twists impossible to ignore. In most stories we hear, the hero falls in love with whoever saves him. But here, things are quite different. Vincent Moretti didn't see love in Sarah's words. He saw strategy. He saw a fat woman trying to cling to any crack, to not die. He knew very well how fear could make people lie with their soul in their eyes. Still, he didn't kill her. He lowered the gun, took a deep breath, and gave a dry order. Keep her alive? It wasn't mercy. It was curiosity, a kind of cold, almost scientific interest. He wanted to know who that woman was with no spark, no known face, no beauty whatsoever in his eyes, who had the courage or madness to say, "I love you," with death breathing down her neck. And no matter how much he tried to deny it, that moved him, not out of affection, but because it was too strange to ignore. In the following days, Sarah came to live as a prisoner inside a mansion that seemed straight out of a crime movie. It had no bars, but it also had no freedom. She was watched all the time, from bath to coffee. The henchmen looked at her with contempt, as if she were a burden. And Vincent? He barely appeared. When he showed up, he looked at her as if trying to decipher a code. He never spoke much. He just observed. And Sarah, who always knew how to slip through the cracks of the world, decided to use what she had: calm listening and a kindness that came from the soul. She didn't confront head-on, but she didn't grovel either. She talked to the guards like someone talking to neighbors. She cooked of her own will. She hummed quietly while washing dishes. And that little by little began to cause a silent discomfort in Vincent, because she didn't seem to fear him. And that confused him deeply. It's interesting how human beings, when vulnerable, can see things they never noticed before. Vincent didn't see beauty in Sarah. Not yet, but he began to perceive something different in her. A light presence, an absence of falseness, a silence that didn't beg for anything, but carried a lot. And that woman, who arrived as an inconvenient witness, became a presence he couldn't ignore, no matter how much he wanted to maintain the role of the cruel boss. Inside, something was beginning to give way, as if that "I love you," even though false, had planted a seed. And from there on, the game was no longer just about control, power, or survival. It was about understanding why, among so many people, that woman, fat, common, invisible, had moved him, and that he still didn't know how to answer. In the mansion, time seemed to run at a different pace. The day dawned and set without promises of change, but inside, something subtle was happening, mainly with Vincent. He watched Sarah from a distance, always in silence, not out of surveillance, but because something about her intrigued him in a way he couldn't explain. She did everything with a disconcerting naturalness. She talked to the henchmen as if they were common people, smiled slightly while cutting vegetables in the kitchen, and even hummed while sweeping the patio. There was no fear in her gestures. There was acceptance, not a submissive acceptance, but the kind that comes from those who have already been beaten too much by life and learned to be light, even while carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. And that moved him, because Vincent always knew how to control everything, except what he didn't understand. He tried to see her as a fat and insignificant hostage, as he did in the first days. But with the passage of time, that label began to lose meaning, because she didn't beg to leave, didn't cry in corners, didn't play the victim. She was just herself, and that, in an environment full of masks, was almost an affront. It was as if she had come from another world, where calm was worth more than appearance, and affection wasn't currency for exchange. Sarah didn't provoke him, but she didn't shrink either. And Vincent, who had always been surrounded by sycophants and traitors, began to perceive the value of that. It wasn't physical attraction yet. He didn't even know what it was. But it was a good discomfort, like when you miss something you never had, but suddenly find in someone. And she, with her simple way, became that presence. In fact, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Sarah was, at that moment, the only piece of humanity in that place. The obese woman, whom the world insisted on ignoring, was being seen by someone who never looked at anyone but himself. And perhaps that's precisely what creates the most powerful real stories, when two lonelinesses recognize each other, even if through crooked paths. Vincent wasn't in love, not yet, but he was beginning to lower his guard, and didn't even realize it. He started paying attention to details. The way she laughed at herself, how she served coffee without expecting thanks, or how she looked at each person with the same kindness. It was all so different from the violent world he had built that it began to become a silent addiction. And without knowing, Vincent began to desire more of those moments. Because deep down, for the first time, he didn't feel feared. He felt seen. It was on a tense afternoon that everything collapsed. One of Vincent's informants had leaked information, and an ambush was set up. Gunshots echoed through the mansion's corridors like war thunder. Sarah, who had already gotten used to the cold silence of that place, found herself in the middle of deafening chaos. Bodies running, muffled screams, and the sharp sound of bullets cutting through the air. She tried to hide, as anyone would, but it was there between fear and instinct that she saw something that made her freeze. Vincent on the ground, bleeding, a precise shot to the shoulder, and no one around. The henchman had retreated, probably following some security protocol. But she ran. Against all logic, she ran to him. Her knees hit the floor beside him, and with trembling hands, She tore his shirt to stop the bleeding. And at that moment, for the first time, the untouchable Vincent Moretti needed someone. He tried to push her away. He muttered a "let go of me" through gritted teeth, still prisoner to pride of someone who never needed anyone. But there was pain in his eyes, not just physical, but that of someone who was never truly cared for. Sarah wasn't intimidated. She tore a cloth, pressed the wound, and spoke softly, almost as if cradling a child. "It'll pass. Stay with me." And that disarmed him more than any weapon could. For the first time, he saw himself small before someone. Not weak. Human. And that had nothing to do with beauty, status, or interest. It had to do with truth. With the sincere touch of someone who, even with 1,000 reasons to hate him, chose to care. And in that simple gesture, almost silent, what no lie could sustain was born. Connection. Not a movie love yet, but something rarer. Recognition of souls. The curious thing is that it was in that moment of weakness that he really saw her. For the first time, Vincent's eyes didn't stop at the body outside the standard or the appearance judged as plain. He saw the woman, the human being, the strength behind the pain. And there, between blood and silence, he perceived something he had perhaps never felt in his life. Security. Not the security of guns, fences, or loyal men, but the emotional security of being accepted. And that got him good. It was as if everything he tried to build with fear and violence was crumbling at the gentle touch of a woman the world ignored. An obese woman, invisible to others' eyes, but who at that moment was becoming the center of his world. And so, between pain and care, the hardest truth to face began to be born. He was no longer the same, and she was no longer just a hostage. The days that followed the ambush were strangely silent. The atmosphere in the mansion was still tense. The henchmen walked around armed like shadows on alert. But something there had changed, and it wasn't just a security protocol. Vincent, now with his arm bandaged and slower steps, spent most of his time in silence, not because of physical pain, but because of a discomfort he couldn't name. Sarah continued her routine the way she always did. She washed, cooked, took care of the plants and corners of the house, as if all of that were hers. But now, something in Vincent's eyes had changed. He watched her from afar, with a look that left aside judgment, and began to wonder, how did I never see this before? And that moved him in a different way, almost uncomfortable. It was as if she had become a mirror, and, for the first time, he was seeing the monster he was. It's funny how truth hides in small things. It was in a laugh from Sarah, unpretentious and light, that he realized. She knew how to laugh at herself. Something he never knew how to do. She joked about her own stumbles, about the tight pants that tore from time to time, or about the cake that burned because she got distracted humming. And even so, no one laughed at her, because she laughed along. It was a silent strength that came from acceptance, not resignation. While Vincent built a life of control, disguised as in fear, she survived being exactly who she was, without hiding. And that, in that world of masks and secrets, was a revolution. He began to notice how she treated even the coldest men in the house with tenderness. Not because she was naive, but because she saw in them what no one else saw. Humanity. And there, for the first time, he began to desire to be seen that way too. Sarah, without making any effort, was tearing down the walls he took decades to build. She didn't charge anything, didn't demand, didn't expect reward. Her presence didn't hurt Vincent's ego. It healed, with simplicity, with sweetness, with a truth he didn't even know existed anymore in the world. And there, in moments when no one saw, he began to face something he never had the courage to, his own emptiness. The same man who had everything, money, power, respect by force, now found himself moved by a woman the world didn't look at twice. And that's why these emotional stories are so rare. Because they are born where no one expects, in deep silences, far from appearances. He still didn't say anything out loud, didn't confess what he felt, but he already knew. He knew that she was the first person who saw him as more than a monster, and that changed everything. In a world where loyalty is measured in gunshots and silence, nothing is more dangerous than showing weakness, especially when it comes to the mob boss. Vincent, who until then seemed untouchable, begins to show signs of something his men would never expect. affection for the hostage. And you know how that's seen in a place where trust is rare currency? As a betrayal. One of the henchmen, always attentive to any slip, noticed a change. He observed the exchanged glances, the small kindnesses, and smelled the threat that represented Vincent's absolute power. And what did he do? He planned what Vincent least expected. Kidnap Sarah and sell her to the rival gang, as if she were just an object in a dirty chess game. It was the last straw. The relentless world Vincent lived in didn't tolerate weakness. And that betrayal revealed that he, inside, had already changed. When Vincent discovers what happened, the cold and calculating man completely disappears. In his place emerges an avenging demon. The fire burns not only the rival gang's warehouses, but also the structures of the past that Vincent tried to build. He invades hideouts, eliminates henchmen who once followed him blindly, and leaves no stone unturned. It's a relentless revenge, driven not only by the loss of the hostage, but by something deeper, the fear of losing what, without knowing, had already become his greatest treasure. In the midst of destruction, Vincent shows himself vulnerable, but in a way few could understand. He doesn't fight for power, but for the woman he once tried to kill, and who now dominated his thoughts like a hurricane. The world around may seem like chaos, but for him, everything now revolves around her. This brutal turn shows a truth few want to admit. Love, even in its most unlikely forms, has the power to transform the worst of monsters. And for Vincent, the obese woman he underestimated, ignored and humiliated, became the only reason to move forward. The same woman the world never saw, that he thought insignificant, was now the flame that set his soul on fire. This betrayal within the mob, which seemed just a power play, was the trigger for Vincent's transformation. A man who, losing everything, realized that what really mattered was in those small things he tried to erase. The care, the love, and humanity that Sarah, with her simple and true presence, brought back to his life. And so, while the flames consumed the past, a new story began to be written. A story that no one could imagine. Their reunion wasn't marked by grand declarations or cinematic scenes. It was, above all, a reality check. Sarah, after spending days lost in enemy hands, could barely believe that wounded and blood-stained man was really Vincent. He didn't look like the cold and cruel boss who had kidnapped her, but like someone shattered by his own internal struggle. When he knelt before her, tired and without any mask of power, the words came out with the force of the purest truth. You lied when you said you loved me, but now I'm the one who can no longer live without you. There was no irony or doubt in his voice, only the vulnerability that many would never imagine seeing in a man like Vincent. Sarah cried. She cried not only for the fear and pain she went through, but for that unexpected confession that dismantled everything she believed about herself. She, an obese woman who all her life was invisible, rejected, thought it impossible that someone like Vincent could truly fall in love with her. In that instant, between tears and whispers, she asked for forgiveness, not for having lied, but for doubting that she deserved love. And he, with a tired smile and a tenderness he had never shown, kissed her forehead. It was a silent kiss, full of promise and redemption, the mark that something new was being born there. The love that began as a lie to save her life now became the only truth that remained between the two. And it's there that the mystery deepens. How did that story, which seemed destined for a tragic end, become an unexpected path of transformation? How did fear and lies give way to something real, capable of healing deep wounds and revealing the best of two worlds so opposite? It's at this point that the narrative invites us to look beyond the obvious, to question our own beliefs about love, appearance, and redemption. Because, after all, real stories that show us that love has the power to rescue even the most lost souls are not rare, even when it arises from a place as unlikely as the heart of a mob boss. And what comes next is proof that this force can, yes, transform even the worst of monsters. The life that Vincent and Sarah began to build far from the shadow of the mob was simple, yet full of meaning, and completely different from the world of violence and fear that Vincent left behind. He traded the pistol for mechanic's tool, working with his hands, rebuilding engines instead of ruining lives. Sarah, in turn, transformed the dream of caring for others into a small bakery, where the sweetness of the recipes was just a reflection of the affection she put into every detail. In that new universe, The weight of appearances dissolved, and what really mattered was a peace they found together. The obese woman who was once invisible to the world was now seen by the man who most needed to learn to love, and he didn't spare compliments. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." And she, with a smile that carried all the emotion of someone who overcame their own invisibility, knew that, finally, someone saw what the whole world ignored. Their love wasn't born from easy circumstances, nor from a fairy tale. It came from necessity, from the lie that saved a life, but which evolved into the most genuine of connections. It was a love that redeemed the monster inside Vincent, showing that behind any hard and dark exterior, there's a soul capable of being touched, transformed, and rescued. Sarah, the woman who learned to survive in invisibility and rejection, taught the mob boss that true beauty is in what the heart recognizes and not in what the eyes judge. They proved that, even in real stories, the impossible can happen when love breaks barriers, undoes prejudices, and builds new paths where before there was only darkness. And so, that chapter that began with fear, humiliation, and danger ended with hope, rebirth, and freedom. They continued together, far from the past and everything that imprisoned them, living a life where what mattered was a feeling they had for each other, a feeling that transcended labels, bodies, and stories of pain. Because true transformation isn't just about changing what the world sees, but about learning to see yourself and love yourself, even when no one else does. This emotional story isn't just about an obese woman who survived the worst, but about how love, even in the most unlikely forms, can save, heal, and redeem even the darkest heart. And now, have you stopped to think, how many times have you felt invisible like Sarah? How many times did you let fear or rejection win? This story shows us that the power of transformation is within each one, even when everything seems lost. Are you willing to change your life, to use what you have that's most true to defeat your own monsters? What this obese woman taught us is that, even in the worst circumstances, the courage to love and be loved can open doors that no one imagined existed. Now, I want to know from you, what's your real story? What obstacle are you ready to face and overcome? Leave your comment, share your experience, and let's together build a space where each emotional story can become a reason for strength and inspiration. And don't forget, to continue learning about real stories that transform, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Because the journey to change begins when you decide to take the first step, and I'll be here to walk with you. Are you ready for the next chapter of your life?